Hi everyone, this is Anil. Uh, Welcome to GraphQL API setup in ServiceNow video series. This is part 2 of the video series, and in this video we'll talk about how to set up simple GraphQL API to get incident data. And in this video we'll also have a link to the update set which is created as part of this video. Let's get started. First we'll test the API using Insomnia API client, and then we'll see the setup which is done in the background. So here I have constructed a query as an input request, which basically has the namespaces here, and then the query which is being called, and the input parameter which is the sysid of an incident. So again, the idea here is to get incident details for a given sysid, and we are fetching active, state, ID, priority, and severity, these 5 attributes. So if I click on send, we'll get a response back, which is giving the details of this incident. So you can see that the ID is matching the SysID here, which proves that this is the right data for this input I'm sending, and it gives me the active flag, the state, priority, and severity. Now we will see what is the setup needed in the background within ServiceNow to achieve this output. To do that, let's log into ServiceNow, and there are like 5 steps involved in this. Let's first look at that. So if we go here, so the first step is to create GraphQL API. The second step is to create the script include, which does the work of querying ServiceNow database and fetching the data. Then the next step is to create a fixed script to test the script include. Then there is some additional setup required within the GraphQL API to consume the script include and resolve that. So let's get started with the GraphQL API piece. So to do that, let's go to ServiceNow and navigate from application navigation, GraphQL Explore API. So if you search for GraphQL API under System Web Services GraphQL APIs, you'll see this API that I have set up. The API name is VaranGQL Inc. So I click on that. So here you have, so as soon as you create a new API, it gives you an application namespace. This is system generated. So this is not editable, right? And then there is schema namespace, which you can give a name based on the purpose of this API and then the name of the API. And these two things are used in the query that we're making. For example, from the Insomnia client, as you can see, this is the application namespace and this is the schema namespace which is used here, right? And then within the schema, you can see that, this is a script editor within the schema where you have query and then there is type, and then there is again, like first we start with the schema where you have the definitions like what is the purpose of this API. So you can either have query or you can have a mutation. So query is used to query the data, mutation is used to perform like update, create or delete operations. So in query, you have we make again this. There is something called as get incident, which we have defined, which basically takes input as ID, which is of type string, and it returns incident. As you can see here, there is an exclamation mark, which means it must return incident data or incident object. And then this incident object is defined here, which contains all these attributes like ID, which basically sends sysid.value, which is coming from the source. And then there is state, again of type string, which reads state.displayValue, active, active.displayValue, priority, severity, and so on. So there are also some commented out fields which we'll uncomment as part of the discussion to see how we can update this and see the results, right? So there is a description, there is resolved by, opened by, and so on and so forth, right? But basically you get the idea, right? So we have the schema section which talks about what is the purpose of this API, whether you want to query data or whether you want to perform like update or create operations. And then if it's query, then what is the function that uh, that user will be calling to query the data, and then what is the input, what is the output, right? So this is what is defined in the schema. Then we have these other pieces like uh, GraphQL scripted resolver, GraphQL resolver mappings. We'll come to that in a minute, but first we'll cover the script include. So let's go to script includes. So here, system definition, script includes. We'll look for updated. Yeah, so this is the script include. So as you can see here, this is the script within the script include. Now, if you observe closely, you'll see that the format of the script is slightly different from the general script includes. Like if you create a script include, this is how it looks like. There's a class and there's a prototype function, and then within there's a prototype object, and then within that you have these functions, right? But the one which we use for GraphQL is slightly different. It has a function, and within that you have this like components within the function, right? So you have to align to the same format for this to work. Again, the best way to start learning GraphQL is to make a copy of existing code and modify it instead of trying to figuring out from scratch, right? So if you see the script include here, it has all this. So we are defining the incident table, which is incident here, and then there's a function get incident details, which basically is doing the work of taking the input as inc id, which is this id, and then it is returning user, I mean like user inc, which is the incident object itself, right? And then we are now verifying if the person who's the the user id which is trying to access this API, if it can read or not, and then if and then we return the object back to that, right? So, and you also can like write some info message back and return null if the user who's trying to access doesn't have the required permissions, right? And then within this function get inc, you can see that we are making a glad record call to incident table, and then we are returning the incident object inc based on the sysid, which is nothing but inc id. And here, since we are making the call to build this object, and that is done here, where we are returning the sysid state active priority severity, which is mentioned here, sysid state active priority and severity. So this is the script include that does all the work in the background, right? And then there is a return statement which basically maps uh, the get incident details to get incident details, which is nothing but the function which is called, and the response we send back, right? Again, as I mentioned, the structure of this script include should remain closest to this as possible. So yeah, so it's always best to make a copy of this and then update it if you're starting, I mean, if you're learning this for the first time or doing this for the first time. Next, we talk about the next piece, which is fix script to test the script include. So let's open that. So we can do this from the history. So just type fix scripts, and you can see that there's a fix script which we have created. Here, I'm making the call to the same script include and then this method, and I'm passing the sysid, and I'm fetching the active flag. So let's run this. I'll run this in the foreground because I know I don't have a lot of data in the system. So you can see that the value is true, right? Now this is the incident I'm querying. So if I just do show XML here, you can see that active is true, right? That proves that my script include is working fine. Now next we'll talk about the remaining pieces in the GraphQL, which is GraphQL scripted resolver and resolver mapping. So let's start with scripted resolver. As the name says, scripted resolver means it resolves the script include. So you can see that we are making a call to the script include which we have just created into the method we have created within the script include, and we are passing this ID, which comes as input from the API. So again, this declaration is all, again, you have to implement it exactly as is. So as I mentioned previously, so it's best to make a copy of the existing code and do it, right? So env.getArguments.id is how you pass the parameters to this, or how you read the arguments from the API, right? So this is about the scripted resolver. Now let's come out of this. And so now we have the script include uh, the schema, the script include the resolver. Now we have to tie this resolver to the API. So that is done as part of let's go back here. So that is done by resolver mapping. So if you scroll down, resolver mappings, click on this. So this is a drop down, so which means you don't have to manually type it. It will tell you what is the query which is available. So we can select query colon get incident. And then it also tells you like what are the available resolvers. So for this API, it is get incident resolver, right? So that's how you tie this script include to this the query. Now click on update. So that covers the various pieces which are involved as part of this setup. Next, we'll see how to extend this. For example, if you want to add, let's say, description to the scope of this. So let's save this and let's make a call. Let's uncomment this here and send it. So at this point, we'll get a response as null. The reason why you're getting that is because in the script include, we have not added description, which is why we're getting the response as null. So let's go to script include and add description here, which is like this, the description colon inc record dot description and save it. So once we do that, I go to my REST client and I query it. So I can see that this is my description. I can verify that back in the incident. So this is my description. So I can just update it, test update, save it, and come back here and send it. So I can see that my description is getting updated in the response, right? So this is the, yeah, so this is how the setup is done and this is how you can test it. So let's do a quick recap, right? The scope of this video is to show you how to set up a simple GraphQL API to get incident data. There are 5 steps involved. First is the API setup, then create a script include, then a fixed script to test the script include, and then do additional setup within the API to consume the script include, right? So this is how the API looks like. It has a application namespace, schema namespace, and a schema. The schema defines what this API will do, whether it is making a query or whether it is doing an update or create operations using mutation. So within the query, you define what is the what user can like what is the query that user has to make a call, right? And then we define like what are the attributes or the input parameters that have to be passed to the query. And then we also define what is the output object. And within the output object, you define the elements like what are the various components of the output object. It's just done here. Once we do this definition, then we create a script include which does all the work in the background, which basically, again, the script include construction is slightly different from the standard script include. So there is no class create, instead we see a function, right? And within the script include, this is a construct of the script include. Basically, there is one function which does the actual mapping of the output variables to the input variables, right? And then we have, again, a fixed script to verify that the script include is correctly defined. And then finally, within the GraphQL API, we define a scripted resolver mapping, which maps the script include back to the API. And then, which basically resolve the script include. And then there is a resolver mapping, which maps the query to the resolver, right? So that is what the setup is done here. And once all of this is done, when you test it, you can see that there is a response back from ServiceNow with the information requested. Thank you for watching. This is Anil.